So have you ever been in a conversation that just went sideways? Maybe it started out fine. You were talking over a meal or catching up with a friend, and before you knew it, something was said that uncovered some sort of disagreement between the two of you, and voices got tense, and feelings ended up getting a little bit hurt, and the whole thing just went off the rails. It happens so easily these days, doesn't it? We live in a time when people don't just disagree, they tend to disdain one another when they disagree. You can feel it in our families or among friends, even within churches. Scroll through social media for 5 minutes and it feels like less like conversation and more like combat, especially in the comments. The sad truth is that polarization has crept into our families, our friendships, and even our churches. Divisions abound in our society. Red states versus blue states, liberals versus conservatives, black versus white, rich versus poor, Americans versus immigrants, gay versus straight, male versus female. And here's one I'm guilty of, OSU versus Michigan. Divisions abound even within the church. Protestant versus Catholic, Methodist versus Baptist, liberal versus conservative. And these divisions have impacted our relationships with our families and our friends. And when we take a step back and look at all the things that divide us in this world, it's kind of amazing that we're still here, isn't it? The world is broken. You might even go so far to say is that it has been shattered by all the things that we use to divide ourselves from others. So what does it mean to follow Jesus in this kind of world? In our interactions with others, how do we speak truth and love at the same time? That's what we're exploring today. All month long, we've been looking at the way of Jesus, the patterns and the postures that shaped his life and that can shape ours. And this morning, we're focusing on the way of civil discourse, how Jesus showed us a better way to speak and to listen and to seek understanding, even when we disagree. As we read the Gospels, we find that Jesus never avoided hard conversations. He spoke truth to power, and he challenged injustice, but he did so with compassion and with calm strength. Jesus spoke truth with incredible clarity, but never with contempt. He didn't shy away from hard conversations, but he never treated people as enemies to defeat. He saw them as beloved children of God to reach and to redeem and to love. Take Zacchaeus, for example, in Luke chapter 19. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. He was someone that most people despised. But instead of calling out to Zacchaeus in anger, Jesus simply calls him by name. Zacchaeus, come down, for I must stay at your house today. In doing so, Jesus refuses to join the public scorn of Zacchaeus, and instead he chooses personal connection. He doesn't lecture Zacchaeus about his greed. He shares a meal with him. And that simple act of respect and relationship leads to transformation in Zacchaeus' life. Zacchaeus stands up and says, "Today, half of my possessions I will give to the poor." It's the result of Jesus showing conviction without contempt. Or think about that woman that was caught in adultery that we read about in John chapter 8. The crowd really wants to use this woman as bait for a moral argument. They're ready to throw stones at her. And Jesus does not deny that her sin is real, but he reminds everyone that judgment is God's job, not ours. Let the one without sin cast the first stone, Jesus says. And when the crowds disperse, Jesus turns to her and says, neither do I condemn you. Go now and sin no more. Jesus holds grace and truth in perfect balance. And then there's the story of the rich young ruler that we find in Mark chapter 10. This young man asks Jesus what he must do to inherit eternal life. And Jesus looks at him, and the scripture says that Jesus loved him. Before telling this young man the hard truth that he had to say, before saying, sell what you have, give to the poor, and follow me, Jesus' motivation, first and foremost, is love. Here again, Jesus demonstrates conviction that is delivered through compassion. Over and over again, Jesus shows us that the goal is not to win arguments. The goal is to win hearts. He speaks truth, but always in a way that opens the possibility for relationship and reconciliation and transformation. So as followers of Jesus in our day, we are invited to do the same, to be people who can hold strong convictions without letting contempt take hold of our hearts. Because the way of Jesus isn't just about being right, it's about being loving, even when we disagree. And that same spirit carries into the early church. Not about being right, about being loving, even when we disagree. The Apostle Paul picks up on this idea in his letter to the Ephesians. He's writing to a community that's learning how to live together in community. They're people from different backgrounds. They have different opinions and different experiences of life, and they're all trying to follow Jesus side by side. And in this morning's text from the letter to the Ephesians in chapter 4, Paul urges the people, writing, I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love. And later he adds, so then, putting away all falsehood, let all of us speak the truth to our neighbors. But let no evil talk come out of your mouths, but only what is useful for building up. In other words, what Paul is saying is that if we are going to live the way of Jesus, it's not just about what we say, it's about how we say it. Truth matters, but so does tone. Conviction matters, but so does compassion. And James echoes this same wisdom when he writes, let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. That's not just good advice, it's a spiritual discipline. It's how we make room for the Spirit to work in our conversations. It's how we keep our hearts soft and our words life-giving. And long before Paul or James put these words on paper, the writer of Proverbs captured the same truth, writing, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. We find that in Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1. The wisdom of these writers runs deep and consistent from Proverbs to James to Paul to Jesus himself. The way that we speak matters. Our tone can either fan the flames of division or it can turn down the temperature so that understanding can grow. So when we bring all of these teachings together, we see a clear picture of the way of Jesus. And that is the way of speaking the truth with humility, listening with patience, and responding with gentleness. That's how disciples of Jesus transform conversations and maybe even relationships in a world that has forgotten how to talk to one another. True discipleship is not only about what we believe, but about how we communicate those beliefs. Now, I think most of us have seen how this plays out in our everyday life. Maybe you've seen this in your own family, that moment when tensions were rising around the dinner table, voices were getting louder, and everyone is trying to make their point. And then someone, maybe it was even you, or maybe it was somebody else, but someone chose to take a breath, and then they spoke gently instead of matching the volume and the tone of the conversation. And suddenly the whole room softened. The argument deflated. People actually started to listen again. That's the power of the soft answer that the proverb speaks about. It doesn't mean that we avoid the truth or back down from what we believe. It just means that we choose a tone that keeps the door open instead of slamming it shut. It's the kind of response that says, I see you as a person, even though I disagree with you. When Paul says, speak the truth in love, and when James says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger, and when Proverbs reminds us that a soft answer turns away wrath, they're all pointing to the same thing. They're pointing to the truth that our words have the power either to wound or to heal. And in a world that feels increasingly loud and divided, followers of Jesus are called to be the ones who bring peace into the conversation, not by avoiding the hard truths, but by embodying the grace and gentleness of the one whom we claim to follow. And this isn't just about being polite or learning better communication skills. This is about our witness as followers of Jesus. It's about the way we speak to and about others, especially those we disagree with. And the way that we do that either draws people toward Christ or pushes them away. That's our witness. The way of Jesus isn't just about getting along, though. It's about growing closer to Christ and closer to one another. As we draw closer to Jesus, we draw closer to God. And as we draw closer to God, we draw closer to one another. So I want to give you an image for that. Imagine for a moment that God is right here in the sanctuary, about halfway down the center aisle of our sanctuary, and God is right there. Now, wherever you are sitting, I'd like you to take your right hand and point to that same, or just reach out to that same spot. Everybody reach out right there. See what's happening here? As we reach toward God, we also reach toward one another, right? So if God is truly at the center of all that is, then every movement toward God brings us closer to one another. Friends, that's God's dream for the world. Complete unity in love. When we come together, when we build relationships, when we unite around Christ as the center, incredible things become possible. Transformation happens. The kingdom of God draws nearer. That's why Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane for our unity in John 17. Because when we're united in love, the world gets a glimpse of God. But of course, that vision of unity can feel far from the reality that we experience in the world we live in today. And God longs for us to be united, yet we so often remain divided, don't we? And if we're honest, we don't always make much of an effort to interact with those who see things differently than we do. Instead of moving toward the center, toward God and toward one another, we tend to drift apart and remain separated in our own camps. We have a strong tendency to only want to hear things that we agree with. Liberal or progressively minded folks tend to only listen to or watch MSNBC. Conservative-minded folks usually only watch Fox News. And CNN, in their attempt to appeal to everyone, often pits both sides off of each other like it's a sport, literally. At one point, CNN hired former sports programming executives who decided to employ a strategy of putting both sides on a panel so that they can fight with each other just for the sporting value of the competition. And we watch it, and we root for our side, and we can't believe that the other side is as wrong as they are. And all the while, our ability to stay in relationship with those with whom we disagree continues to erode. Think about it in your own life. Do you have any relatives with whom your relationship is strained because of some disagreement that you have? Have you unfollowed friends on social media because of things that they post that you disagree with? Do you avoid coworkers who you know see the world differently than you do? If someone says something that we don't like or that we disagree with, we have a tendency to shut them down or tune them out or otherwise cut off relationship with them. How many people are essentially dead to us because at one point or another we disagreed with them? Friends, I think we can do better. In fact, I know we can do better. God calls us to do better. One of my challenges as your pastor is to find ways to speak to the issues that we face in our everyday lives in ways that all people will be able to hear. Despite the unity that our core values bring to us, it's clear that we are not of one mind in our congregation. If I appear to be on one side of any particular issue, any issue that you can come up with, there will be people who cheer for me, and there will be people who fume at what I said. And unfortunately, I continue to hear stories of people who have felt uncomfortable sharing their thoughts in a small group setting here within our congregation. I continue to hear about folks who say that they've left our church because they don't feel heard or honored or that their viewpoint has a place within our community. And so I wonder, how will we remain in relationship with each other? Will we remain in relationship? As we've talked about recently, there are more and more people in our society who have nothing to do with the church. And let's be honest, many people today haven't walked away from faith because of theology. They've walked away from faith because of tone. They've experienced harshness instead of humility. They've experienced judgment instead of grace. They've experienced hypocrisy instead of love. And you know what? That breaks God's heart. So when we talk about living into our new vision of being more than Sunday, more than church, this is the kind of stuff we're talking about. Following Jesus is not confined to what happens in this building for 1 hour on Sunday morning. It's lived out in the way that we speak and in the way that we listen. At the office, on social media, around the dinner table, even in the midst of disagreement. The world is full of shouting right now. Anger, sarcasm, outrage. But the church can offer something different. We can be those people who model grace, a grace-filled dialogue. We can be those people who show what it looks like to live with conviction and also with compassion. We can stand up for what we believe in and we can speak truth to power, but let us do so with love. Because when our words reflect the love of Christ, that love becomes real for others in the world. So what if? What if our witness to the Dublin community was one of love despite disagreement? What if people could say, you know, those folks there over at Indian Run United Methodist Church, they sure do embody love even when they disagree? What if that was one of the ways that we grew love in ourselves and in our families and in our community and in the world? I believe we can do it, but it will take practice. And I've often understood that idea of practicing your faith to be more like what an athlete or a musician does when they are practicing. Practice is that time when you can make mistakes in the safety of the team or the group that you're with so that you can get better. You run drills or you go through the scales over and over and over to hone your craft. So what if the church was like the practice field or the rehearsal room? What if we came together to encourage each other and to practice loving one another despite our disagreements? Surely we're going to make mistakes along the way. But when one of us does, what if we offered that same grace that God offers to us through Jesus? What if we said something like, boy, I sure don't agree with you on that, but let's talk about it and let's learn from each other. If we practiced our faith in that way, in the safety of our life together, we might just be able to live more like Jesus out in the world. Speaking of living like Jesus out in the world in the rest of our life, how do we do that? How do we practice the way of Jesus when it comes to our words and our conversations? I'd like to share a few simple but powerful disciplines, spiritual practices for everyday dialogue. Think about them as 5 rules for civil discourse. First, pause before you post. Before hitting that send button, ask yourself, does this reflect the love of Christ? Imagine Jesus sitting right next to you as you're typing it in. Would you still write the same thing? Taking just a few seconds of reflection can turn a reactive post into a redemptive one. Next, listen to understand, not to respond. Listening is an act of love. It's how we honor the image of God in the other person. When we truly listen, setting aside our need to be right, we then create sacred space where empathy and healing can begin. Next, assume good intentions. Give others the benefit of the doubt, that same grace that you would hope they would give you. Most people are just doing their best with the information and the experiences that they have. Assuming goodwill opens the door for dialogue instead of defensiveness. Next, use I statements. Speak from your own experience instead of labeling or caricaturizing someone else's. I statements invite conversation rather than confrontation. They make it possible to express truth with humility instead of accusation. And finally, pray before speaking or typing or posting. Let Psalm 19, verse 14 guide you. That psalm that says, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord." Prayer grounds our words in God's Spirit. And when we pause to pray, our tone softens, our hearts open, and our words become instruments of grace rather than weapons of pride. So maybe you could take some time this week to focus on 1 or 2 or 3. If you can do all 5, great. Well done. but let's put these into practice this week. Let's use these as we engage with others this coming week, making a commitment to pause or to listen, to speak with love. Just imagine if we did so, how different our families and our workplaces and even our social media feeds might be if we all practiced these 5 rules together. Because here's the truth. The world does not need louder Christians. It needs kinder ones. The world doesn't need people who can win every argument. It needs people who can stay in relationship even when they disagree. Following Jesus means embodying a love that is patient and humble and gracious, a love that builds bridges rather than destroying them. Here's a quote that I love. It says, "Be known for your love more than your opinions." I think we have a slide for that. Be known for your love more than your opinions. That's the kind of witness that I think our world is hungry for right now. To follow the way of Jesus in a divided world means speaking and listening with grace. Civil discourse is not about avoiding disagreement. It's about engaging difference with love, with humility, with respect, so that Christ's spirit of peace can be seen in us. Because in the end, the closer we move toward the heart of Christ, the closer we move toward one another. So may our words and our actions this week draw us not only nearer to God, but also nearer to our neighbors, until the love of Christ is made visible in the way that we speak and the way that we listen and the way that we live together. So may the Spirit shape our words this week, in person or online or at work or at home, so that our words might become instruments of peace. May our tone reflect our teacher. And may those who hear us hear something unmistakably Christ-like, truth spoken with love.